The Italian diaspora is the large-scale migration of Italians away from Italy in the period between the unification of Italy in 1861 and the rise of Italian Fascism during the 1920s, as well as one last wave which can be observed after the end of World War II. Overview. Poverty was the main reason for the diaspora. Italy was until the 1860s a partially rural society where land management practices, especially in the south and northeast, did not easily convince farmers to stay on the land and work the soil. Another characteristic was related to the overpopulation of southern Italy after the improvements of the socio-economic conditions following the unification process. Indeed, southern Italian families after 1861 started to have access to hospitals, improved hygienic conditions and normal food supply. This created a demographic boom and forced the new generations to emigrate en masse at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, mostly to the Americas. Between 1861 and 1985, 29,036,000 Italians emigrated to other countries, of whom 16 million arrived before the outbreak of World War I. About 10,275,000 returned to Italy, while 18,761,000 permanently settled abroad. In 2011 in the world there were 4,115,235 Italian citizens living outside Italy and several tens of millions of descendants of Italians who emigrated in the last 2 centuries. History. The unification of Italy broke down the feudal land system, which had survived in the south since the Middle Ages, especially where land had been the inalienable property of aristocrats, religious bodies of the king. The breakdown of feudalism, however, and redistribution of land did not necessarily lead to small farmers in the south winding up with land of their own, a land they could work and profit from. Many remained landless, and plots grew smaller and smaller and so less and less productive as land was subdivided among heirs. Between 1860 and World War I, 9 million Italians left, most from the north and most going to north of South America. As the number of Italian emigrants abroad increased, so did the remittances, which encouraged further emigration, even in the face of factors that might logically be thought to decrease the need to leave, such as increased wages at home. It has been termed persistent and path-dependent emigration flow. Friends and relatives who left first sent back money for tickets and helped relatives as they arrived. That tended to support an emigration flow, since even improving conditions in the original country took a while to trickle down to potential emigrants to convince them not to leave. The emigrant flow was stemmed only by dramatic events, such as the outbreak of World War I, which greatly disrupted the flow of people trying to leave Europe, and the restrictions on immigration that were put in place by receiving countries. Examples of such restrictions in the United States were the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924. Restrictive legislation to limit emigration from Italy was introduced by the fascist government of the 1920s and 30s. The Italian diaspora did not affect all regions of the nation equally. In the second phase of emigration, slightly less than half of emigrants were from the south and most of them were from rural areas, as they were driven off the land by inefficient land management, lawlessness and sickness. Robert Forster, in Italian Emigration of Our Times, says, well-nigh expulsion, it has been exodus. In the sense of depopulation, it has been characteristically permanent. Mesadria, a form of share farming where tenant families obtained a plot to work on from an owner and kept a reasonable share of the profits, was more prevalent in central Italy, which is one of the reasons that there was less emigration from that part of Italy. The south lacked entrepreneurs, and absentee landlords were common. Although owning land was the basic yardstick of wealth, farming that was socially despised. People invested not in agricultural equipment but in such things as low-risk state bonds. The rule that emigration from cities was negligible has an important exception in Naples. The city went from being the capital of its own kingdom in 1860 to being just another large city in Italy. The loss of bureaucratical jobs and the subsequently declining financial situation led to high unemployment. In the early 1880s, epidemics of cholera also struck the city, causing many people to leave. The epidemics were the driving force behind the decision to rebuild entire sections of the city, an undertaking known as the Risanamento, a pursuit that lasted until the start of World War I. During the first few years before the unification of Italy, emigration was not particularly controlled by the state. Emigrants were often in the hands of emigration agents whose job was to make money for themselves by moving emigrants. Abuses led to the first migration law in Italy, passed in 1888, to bring the many emigration agencies under state control. On the 31st of January 1901, the Commissariat of Emigration was created, granting licenses to carriers, enforcing fixed ticket costs, keeping order at ports of embarkation, providing health inspection for those leaving, setting up hostels and care facilities and arranging agreements with receiving countries to help care for those arriving. The Commissariat tried to take care of emigrants before they left and after they arrived, such as dealing with the American laws that discriminated against alien workers and even suspending, for a while, emigration to Brazil, where many migrants had wound up as virtual slaves on large coffee plantations. The Commissariat also helped to set up remittances sent by emigrants from the United States back to the motherland, which turned into a constant flow of money amounting, by some accounts, to about 5% of the Italian GNP. In 1903, the Commissariat also set the available ports of embarkation as Palermo, Naples and Genoa, excluding the port of Venice, which had previously also been used. LNTOR period. Although the physical perils involved with transatlantic ship traffic during World War I obviously disrupted emigration from all parts of Europe, including Italy, the condition of various national economies in the immediate post-war period was so bad that immigration picked up almost immediately. Foreign newspapers ran scare stories little different than those published 40 years earlier. Somewhat toned down was an article of April 17, 1921 in the same newspaper, under the headline, "Italians coming in great numbers, and number of immigrants will be limited only by capacity of liners," and that potential emigrants were thronging the quays in the cities of Genoa. Also, the stranger walking though a city like Naples can easily realize the problem the government has to deal with. The side streets are literally swarming with children who sprawl in the paved roadway and on the sidewalks. They look dirty and happy. Suburbs of Naples swarm with children who, for number, can only be compared to those in Delhi, Agra and other cities in the East Indies. The extreme economic difficulties of post-war Italy and the severe internal tensions within the nation, which led to the rise of fascism, led 614,000 emigrants away in 1920, half of them going to the United States. When the fascists came to power in 1922, there was a general slowdown in the flow of emigrants from Italy. Eventually, however, during the first 5 years of fascism, 1.5 million people left Italy. By then, the nature of the emigrants had changed. There was, for example, a marked marked increase in the rise of relatives outside of the working age moving to be with the families who had already left Italy. By region, Libya had some 150,000 Italian settlers when Italy entered the war in 1940. World War II, constituting about 18% of the total population in Italian Libya. The Italians in Libya resided in most major cities like Tripoli, Benghazi, and Hun. The numbers decreased after 1936. The French and English took over the spoils of war that included Italian discovery and technical expertise in the extraction and production of crude oil, superhighways, irrigation, electricity. Most of Libya's Italians were expelled from the North African country in 1970, a year after Muammar Gaddafi seized power, but a few hundred Italian settlers returned to Libya in the 2000s. Somalia had some 50,000 Italian Somali settlers during World War II, constituting about 5% of the total population in Italian Somaliland. The Italians resided in most major cities in the central and southern parts of the territory, with around 10,000 living in the capital Mogadishu. Other major areas of settlement included Jaffa, which was founded by the Italian Prince Luigi Amadeo, Duke of the Abruzzi. Italian used to be a major language, but its influence significantly diminished following independence. It is now most frequently heard among older generations. South African Italians. Although Italians did not immigrate to South Africa in large numbers, those who have arrived have nevertheless made an impact on the host country. Before World War II, relatively few Italian immigrants arrived, though there were some prominent exceptions such as the Cape's first Prime Minister John Molteno. South African Italians made big headlines during World War II, when Italians captured in Italian East Africa needed to be sent to a safe stronghold to be kept as prisoners of war. South Africa was the perfect destination, and the first powers arrived in Durban in 1941. Despite being powers, the Italians were treated well, with a good food diet and friendly hospitality. These factors, along with the peaceful, cheap, and sunny landscape, made it very attractive for Italians to settle down, and therefore, the Italian South African community was born. Although over 100,000 Italian power were sent to South Africa, only a handful decided to stay, and during the capture, they were given the choice of hard labor or helping spread the genius in agriculture, aqueducts, sewer lines, highway construction, masonry techniques, build chapels, churches, dams, and many more structures. Most Italian influence in architecture can be seen in the Natal and Transvaal area. White South Africans of Italian descent number between 6,300 and 28,059. Today a small Italian community persists in South Africa. Athletes Davide Sommer and Angelo Gigli are a part of this community. Elsewhere in Africa see also Italian Eritreans, Italians of Ethiopia, Italian Egyptians, Italian Tunisians. The Italians had a significantly large, but very quickly diminished population in Africa. In 1926, there were 90,000 Italians in Tunisia, compared to 70,000 Frenchmen. Former Italian communities also once thrived in the Horn of Africa, with about 50,000 Italian settlers living in Eritrea in 1935. The Italian-Eritrean population grew from 4,000 during World War I to nearly 100,000 at the beginning of World War II. Additionally, there were settler communities in Ethiopia. During the 5-year occupation of Ethiopia, roughly 300,000 Italians settled in the Horn of Africa. Over 49,000 lived in Asmara in 1939, and over 38,000 resided in Addis Ababa. The size of the Italian-Egyptian community had also reached around 55,000 just before World War II, forming the second largest expatriate community in Egypt. A few Italian settlers stayed in Portugal's colonies in Africa after World War II, as the Portuguese government had sought to enlarge the small Portuguese population through emigration from Europe. The Italian migrants gradually assimilated into the Angolan Portuguese community. The Americas' Italian immigration to Argentina and Uruguay, along with Spanish, formed the backbone of the Argentine and Uruguayan societies. Minor groups of Italians started to immigrate to Argentina as early as the second half of the 17th century. However, the stream of Italian immigration to Argentina became a mass phenomenon between 1880 to 1920 when Italy was facing social and economic disturbances. Argentine culture has significant connections to Italian culture in terms of language, customs and traditions. It is estimated up to 50 to 60% of the population at 20 million Argentines have full or partial Italian ancestry. According to the Ministry of the Interior of Italy, there are 527,570 Italian citizens living in the Argentine Republic, including Argentines with dual citizenship. Italian Brazilians are the largest number of people with full or partial Italian ancestry outside of Italy, with São Paulo being the most populous city with Italian ancestry in the world. Nowadays, it's possible to find millions of descendants of Italians, from the southeastern state of Minas Gerais to the southernmost state of Rio Grande do Sul, with the majority living in São Paulo state and the highest percentage in the southeastern state of Espírito Santo. Small southern Brazilian towns, such as Nova Veneza, have as much as 95% of the population of Italian descent. A substantial influx of Italian immigrants to Canada began in the early 20th century when over 100,000 Italians, mainly from the South, moved to Canada. In the post-war years, another influx of Italians emigrated to Canada, again from the South but also from the Northeast, namely Veneto and Friuli, and displaced Italians from Istria. Almost 1 million Italians reside in the province of Ontario, making it of strong global representation of the Italian diaspora. For example, Hamilton, Ontario, has around 24,000 residents with ties to its sister city Raccamuto in Sicily. The city of Vaughan, just outside of Toronto, has one of Canada's largest concentrations of Italians at over 30% of the city's total 288,301 population in 2011. Starting in the late 19th century until the 1930s, the United States became a main destination for Italian immigrants, most settling originally in the New York metropolitan area, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, Baltimore and New Orleans. Many Italian Americans still retain aspects of the culture, and although Italian Americans may now be found across the United States, they are most heavily concentrated in the cities of the original immigration and surrounding areas. In movies that deal with cultural issues, Italian American words and lingo are sometimes spoken by the characters. Although many do not speak Italian fluently, over 1 million speak Italian at home according to the 2000 U.S. Census. Another very important Italian community is in Venezuela, which developed especially after the Second World War. They number about 1.8 million, including people with at the least one Italian grandparent. The Italo-Venezuelans have obtained significant results in the contemporary society of Venezuela. The Italian embassy calculates that 1/4 of the Venezuelan industries not related to the oil sector are directly or indirectly owned and/or managed by Italian Venezuelans. Europe. Italian migration in into what is today France has been going on in different migrating cycles from the end of the 19th century to the present. In addition, Corsica passed from the Republic of Genoa to France in 1770, and the area around Nice and Savoy from the Kingdom of Sardinia to France in 1860. Initially, Italian immigration to modern France came predominantly from northern Italy, then from central Italy, mostly to the bordering southeastern region of Provence. It wasn't until after World War II that large numbers of immigrants from southern Italy immigrated to France, usually settling in industrialized areas of France, such as Lorraine, Paris and Lyon. Today, it is estimated that as many as 5 million French nationals have Italian ancestry going back 3 generations. In Switzerland, Italian immigrants reached the country starting in the late 19th century, most of whom eventually came back to Italy after the rise of Italian Fascism. Future fascist leader Benito Mussolini emigrated to Switzerland in 1902, only to be deported after becoming involved in the socialist movement. A new migratory wave began after 1945, favored by the lax immigration laws then in force. The English towns of Bedford and Hoddesdon have sizable Italian populations. A significant number of Italians came to Bedford in the 1950s due to the London Brick Company finding itself short of workers in the wake of the Reconstruction boom. As a result, today Bedford has the largest concentration of Italian families in the UK, and the third highest number of Italian immigrants overall, with around 20,000 of its population of 100,000 being of Italian descent. In Hoddesdon, many Italians, mostly descending from Sicily, migrated there and across the Lea Valley in the 1950s due to opportunities working in local garden nurseries. They were drawn to the area by the rich agricultural landscape and better wages in comparison to back home. Today, the town's Italian community has had such a significant impact that an Italian consul, Carmelo Nicastro, was even elected for the area. Oceania Italians first arrived in Australia in the decades immediately following the unification, but the most significant wave was after World War II ended in 1945, particularly from 1950 to 1965. It was those Italian migrants and the descendants who have had a significant impact on the culture, society and economy of Australia. Italian is the second most spoken language in Australian homes after English, with 316,900 speakers counted in the 2006 census. The 2006 census counted 199,124 persons who were born in Italy, and Italian is the fifth most identified ancestry in Australia with 852,418 responses. Italian Australians experienced a low rate of return migration to Italy relative to the Italian diaspora in other countries. Unlike Australia, New Zealand has never received much immigration from Italy. Several hundreds of them, mostly fishermen, made it in the late 1890s. As of 2011, roughly 3,500 New Zealanders claim Italian heritage. Numbers. After 1890, Italian contribution to the emigration flow to the New World was significant. By 1870, Italy had about 25 million inhabitants. A preliminary census done in 1861, after the annexation of the South, claimed that there were a mere 100,000 Italians living abroad. The General Directorate of Statistics did not start compiling official emigration statistics until 1876. Accurate figures on the decades between 1870 and World War I show how emigration increased dramatically during that period. Italian emigrants per 1,000 population 1870 to 1879 4.29, 1880 to 1889 6.09, 1890 to 1899, 8.65, 1900 to 1913, 17.97. The high point of Italian emigration was in 1913, when 872,598 persons left Italy. By extrapolating from the 25 million inhabitants of Italy at the time of unification, natural birth and death rates without emigration, there would have been a population of about 65 million by 1970. Instead, because of emigration earlier in the century, there were only 54 million. Bibliography. Favero, Luigi. Tassello, Graziano. Cent'anni di emigrazione italiana. Rome. CSER. Sorry, Urkel. La migrazione italiana dall'unità alla seconda guerra mondiale. Bologna. Il Mulino. Moretti, Enrico. Social Networks and Migrations. 1876 to 1913. International Migration Review. The Center for Migration Studies of New York, Inc. 33, 640 to 657. ISSN 0197-9183. JSDOR 2,547,529. Tomasi, Silvano M. Review of La Democrazia Italiana e la Emigrazione in America, by Grazie d'Or, Brescia, Morcellania, 1964. International Migration Digest. 2, 221 to 223. DO 10.2307, 3,002,874. ISSN 05388716.